Alright, so now we start the brown adipose tissue. Before beginning the white adipose tissue, we discussed the embryological origin of the adipose tissue. We said that in the embryo there are mesenchymal stem cells that differentiate to form pre-adipocytes, right? And then these pre-adipocytes go ahead and differentiate to form different adipocytes like white adipocytes and brown adipocytes. There's also beige adipocytes, which is a mixture of the two basically, but we're going to ignore these for now because these are not that relevant and people don't ask all that many questions about beige adipocytes. But white adipocytes and brown adipocytes are very important, and you need to know both of these. Now, this is what happens in basically the embryo, but in adults, the adipocytes come from mesenchymal stem cells that are oriented around capillaries. Okay, so let's move on to the brown adipose tissue. So we said that there are mesenchymal stem cells that differentiate to form pre-adipocytes, and those pre-adipocytes form brown adipocytes. And those brown adipocytes, groups of those brown adipose cells, what they do is that they make this brown adipose tissue. Now, the difference between brown and white adipose tissue and their cells is that their cells, the brown adipocytes, are not unilocular, they are multilocular. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that they have not one single large cavity but multiple lipid droplets or cavities. Okay, so multiple cavities that you can see in a single cell, and that's what we will see on a microscope image in just a bit. Another thing that they contain is a higher number of mitochondria. This is relevant in their function of heat production that we're going to do in just a bit. So they have a higher number of mitochondria, and amazingly, they also have a centrally located nucleus. Okay, they have a centrally located nucleus and not a peripherally located nucleus that is pushed to the cell surface membrane. So these are multilocular, basically means multiple cavities of containing lipids. They have a higher mitochondria, and these have a centrally located nucleus. I'm going to show you an image of the brown adipose tissue, and then we are going to move on to slightly more functional things. Okay. So here's the image of brown adipose tissue. Alright, so in this image we immediately see that the cells have multiple lipid droplets, right? So these cells have multiple lipid droplets, and we can immediately see in almost all of the cells here is that, for example, let's take this cell right here. So we have this cell, and then we have another cell right here. Now, these are polyhedral again, they have multiple faces, but the difference over here is that these cells contain multiple lipid droplets, and we can see that immediately in the cytoplasm of these cells. So let's write that down. This would be multilocular, right? Secondly, these cells contain, so let's look at this cell right here, they have a centrally located nucleus, right? These have a centrally located nucleus and not a nucleus that is pushed to the side, not a nucleus that is peripherally located. So they have a centrally located nucleus. Okay, and if you zoom in a little bit more, you will be able to see more mitochondria, but that shouldn't be relevant because you can easily identify them by these two features. They have a centrally located nucleus, and these are multilocular. So usually brown adipose tissue has a higher number of brown adipocytes, but it also contains some white adipocytes. So in this diagram right here, you can see some white adipocytes, some unilocular cells. For example, right here we have a unilocular cell. Over here as well we have a unilocular cell. Over here as well we have a unilocular cell. And we can see immediately that the differences between the two is that this unilocular cell has a nucleus that is pushed to the side. We cannot see the nucleus in the middle. Its nucleus is somewhere here. This cell's nucleus is probably somewhere here. What about this one? This one's nucleus is over here. So it's pushed to the side, and it has a single large cavity, and therefore it is a unilocular with a nucleus that is peripherally located. Okay, so that was the histological, basically, image example of the brown adipocytes. Now let's move on to the function of the brown adipose tissue in the human body. So what this brown adipose tissue is mainly responsible is to generate heat. Okay, it has this special quality to generate some extra heat inside our body, and that is why it is also innervated by sympathetic innervation to trigger it to generate more heat in certain circumstances. So it has this quality of generating extra heat. The way it does that, I'll show you in just a bit, but let's look at some locations first. So locations for the brown adipose tissue in infants and neonates, which is very, very important. Newborns, and especially infants, they have a brown adipose tissue that is present abundantly in the back and neck, and especially the back of the neck. Okay, the back of the neck and back and neck is where the brown adipose tissue is abundantly found, especially in neonates and infants, because neonates and infants, they don't produce all that much of a body heat to keep themselves warm, so they need some extra help, and that extra help comes from the brown adipose tissue, which is able to generate some extra heat. In adults as well, we need to keep our organs at optimum temperature, for example the heart, right, and the kidneys, and some blood vessels, right? So in the mediastinum, brown adipose tissue is found. In the kidneys, around the kidneys, brown adipose tissue is found, and around the aorta as well. And we will actually look at the example when we study the cardiovascular system. We will look at the example of the heart. Inside the epicardium of the heart, well, the heart has 3 layers, right? What are those layers? Can you remember? Well, the inner layer of the heart is called the endocardium, right? The middle layer is called the myocardium, and the outer layer is the epicardium, right? And in the epicardium, when we do the cardiovascular system chapter, we will look at some slides of the epicardium, and immediately when you see the slide, you should be able to identify the portion of the epicardium that has the brown adipose tissue, because you have looked at the brown adipose tissue image and you know what it looks like. Yeah, it has multilocular. It is multilocular, it has higher mitochondria, and it has basically a centrally located nucleus. 2 very important points. So these are able to generate heat. Now the way it does that, I'll show you by using this diagram right here. Okay, so I'm going to be using this diagram instead of drawing a diagram myself. All right, so we know normally in cells we have certain organelles that are referred to as powerhouses. They're able to produce energy and heat, right? So they produce ATP and heat, and those organelles are called what? They are called mitochondria, right? And the mitochondria, they contain 2 membranes, an outer membrane, right, an inner membrane, a matrix, right, and an intermembrane space. The inner membrane contains a chain called the electron transport chain, which is very important in the generation of ATP and the generation of energy. So a portion of a mitochondria is shown in this diagram here. What's shown here is an intermembrane space, the inner mitochondrial membrane, and mitochondrial matrix. Now in this diagram, we immediately see that there is an electron transport chain that is shown here, and what this ETC is doing, electron transport chain, I'm going to refer to this as ETC. What this ETC is doing is that it is pumping protons that are present inside the matrix into the intermembrane space, right? It is pumping these protons into the intermembrane space, and it is developing a proton gradient. So lots and lots of protons are being accumulated in the intermembrane space. So this side becomes very positive. There's a proton gradient established. Let me write that down, proton gradient. And so the intermembrane space becomes very, very positive as compared to the mitochondrial matrix, right? So this is referred to as P side in biochemistry as well. This becomes the P side, this is the N side, right? Because it's negative. So what essentially happens is that this proton gradient that is established by the ETC, it is used to drive special proteins called ATP synthesis. Here's one shown here, ATP synthesis. Now this ATP synthase is able to use this proton gradient, and it allows the protons to flow back down their concentration gradient from the intermembrane space right here into the mitochondrial matrix. And as these protons flow back into the mitochondrial matrix, they drive this ATP synthase to produce more and more ATP, right? So this proton gradient that was established by the electron transport chain, it is used to drive the ATP synthase to produce more and more ATP. Normally, around 50% of this proton gradient energy is used to make ATP. 50% goes towards making ATP, and the rest of it, which is again 50%, goes to making heat. So the more energy we produce, the more heat we produce, because 50% of this proton gradient is utilized to make energy, and 50% is being used to make heat. So this is what normally happens. Now, it is not very easy for these protons to flow through this ATP synthase. Okay, the ATP synthase is very difficult, provides a very difficult passageway for these protons to flow through. So, if we were to provide another protein here, another wide lumen, easy to flow through channel protein here, for these protons to flow through, then where do you think these protons will prefer to go? Will they prefer to go into the difficult to go through ATP synthase, or the easier to go through new channel protein that we have provided? Obviously, most of them, or almost all of them, will choose to go through the easier passageway. And this special protein is provided in brown adipose tissue. This protein is called uncoupler or uncoupling protein, so UCP, uncoupling protein, or they're also called thermogenin. So with the presence of thermogenin, almost all of the protons flow through the thermogenin instead of the ATP synthase. So we have almost no production of ATP, but all of that proton gradient is then utilized towards making heat instead. So we have almost no production of ATP, maybe 0 or almost close to 0%, and almost controlled to 100% of the proton gradient is being used to make heat. Okay, and that happens because the brown adipose tissue contains a special protein called the uncoupling protein or thermogenin. All right. And this uncoupling protein allows the protons to flow back into the intermembrane space without passing through the ATP synthase, without producing any ATP. So all of that proton gradient is used towards making heat. So instead of 50% that normally occurs, almost 100% of the proton gradient is used to make heat. And that's what occurs in the brown adipose tissue. All right, so let's go back to our neat notes and see the locations again. So we have the locations again. We have it present in the infants and neonates because they need lots and lots of heat. It is present in the back and neck, and in the adults, it is present around the organs, around the viscera, to keep the organs warm. And the way it keeps it warm, we have learned it in our function. I just did that with the other diagram, is that it contains special uncoupling proteins, which are also called thermogenin, which allow the utilization of almost all of the proton gradient to be utilized for production of heat, and almost no production of ATP where the uncoupling protein is present. All right, so earlier we were discussing some clinical correlates to the adipose tissue, right? And we left one out related to the brown adipose tissue, the brown adipocytes. But now we have learned what brown adipocytes are, right? Brown adipocytes are multilocular adipocytes, right? Multilocular, they have a central nucleus and they have lots and lots of mitochondria, right? And inside those mitochondria, they have some special proteins, right? And those proteins are called thermogenin or uncoupling proteins, and they're able to produce extra heat, right? To keep our bodies and organs warm. Now, a tumor, a benign tumor of the brown adipocytes is referred to as a hibernoma. Okay, hibernoma is the benign tumor of brown adipocytes, of multilocular cells that have a central nucleus, that have uncoupling proteins inside their mitochondria. Also, we were discussing some facts related with obesity, is that in obese children there's hyperplasia, which means newer cells and increase in cell size, while in adults they have hypertrophy. And the more obese children and adults are, the more adipose tissue is there, and therefore there's a greater production of leptin as well, which we learned earlier that leptin does what? Leptin inhibits hunger, right? Also, on top of that, excess adipose tissue results in more and more production of cytokines as well. So there's a chronic production of cytokines, which results in a chronic inflammation related to obesity. So on top of the obesity, there's also some chronic inflammation around those tissues because they release cytokines in a chronic fashion. And that's pretty much it for this chapter. So I hope you guys will be able to identify the adipose tissues, the two types of tissues, their differences between them, and their specific features. And yeah, it was wonderful teaching you guys this chapter.